Okay, so welcome to LaRouche PAC's special Zoom discussion. I'll be the host tonight, Mike Steger. It's Thursday, it's July 22nd, and I think many of you have been following the LaRouche PAC Lincoln podcast series. And that's really the central focus tonight is the kind of content that was introduced by Bob Ingram, kind of a resident historian and organizer here with LaRouche PAC. I think Bob will give us some introductory remarks, but over the last couple of months, Bob has said a lot. And this is a chance for people to now bring to bear your thoughts, your questions around the question, not just of what Lincoln did, but how Lincoln is relevant, how Lincoln's presidency, really Lincoln's revival of the American Revolution in principle, in spirit, to bear upon that time is such an important metric and example of what we as the American people and we as citizens in the image of Lincoln, how we can operate today to secure our nation once again. It is attempted to be torn into pieces, to separate the American people, to pit them against one another, to shut down our industry and production, to go to a full-scale cheap labor policy, to import massive amounts of cheap labor. That's what the open border policy has been. That's why the Chamber of Commerce and the Rhino Republicans and Bush League Republican establishments have all backed this policy for decades, why they back NAFTA and globalization. And the same thing is true with this Biden collective, the Liz Cheney acts, and the rest of it. So it's really a critical question today. Now, I think as people know from watching LaRouche PAC, and Barbara Boyd presented this on Monday, we are at a rapid escalation of meltdown of the Biden collective, whether it's the policies they're trying to pass in legislation, Pelosi's January 6th charade, where she said she wanted to be bipartisan. Speaker of the House nominates so many people. She says some of them can't just be on because they would challenge the narrative, as we all know. Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, exposes the fact the military is not only stupid, incompetent, but also seditious. Not the military. It's better put to say the Pentagon, this bureaucracy that thinks of itself as military, but has really just become part of the federal bureaucracy opposed to the interests of the American people. So there's something happening very quickly. You see it in California with the recall, where Gavin Newsom and his coterie are desperately trying to control this election and are not able to do so. But we know that there's something much deeper here at stake. Much of this incompetence of Biden, apparently he was bombing Somalia today. It's a nation apparently with half of its population or near half is in kind of nomadic conditions. The policies of Obama, the perpetual war policies of the Bush-Cheney-Obama era, certainly they would love to reignite that around the world. It's probably why you see the destabilizations in South Africa, Colombia, Haiti, Cuba. It's likely the perpetual war program and crowd. But there's something much more at stake. There's something much deeper to what's been taken from us as an American people and as a nation. It's not just simply the threat of this collective, the threat of surveillance state, the ongoing bailouts, but much of this obfuscates the deeper principles that they don't want us to revive. That was something unique to how Lyndon LaRouche operated. He recognized that was largely the game shared by both of the so-called sides of political spectrum, where they want to keep away that deeper principle. And this is something Lincoln did in ways that were beyond conception when you really look at how effective he was at such an incredibly challenging time. And I think that's really the nature of why this question of Lincoln is so important today. President Trump is incredibly active. He's reviving that spirit. this working man's, working class Republican Party. But the spirit of Lincoln and the principles of Lincoln and the American system, the American Revolution, are something we can all spend more time reviving and considering. So that's really the nature of the discussion tonight. So please have your notes, your thoughts, your reflections upon the podcast series kind of re-jogged in your mind. And I'll hand it off to Bob for some introductory remarks, and we'll jump into the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So yeah, there's just 2 or 3 things I want to go through quickly, maybe 20 minutes or so, and then we can get right into the discussion. The first thing I want to bring up is this question of national sovereignty, because I want to discuss it in a way that probably a lot of people have not thought about it in this way. And what I want to refer to is a debate that took place in the United States Senate in January of 1861. Now, this is January of 1861. 6 or maybe 7 states had already seceded from the Union. And the country was poised at the brink of the Civil War. And there was a debate that took place between 2 US senators, Judah Benjamin of Louisiana, who later went on to become the Secretary of War in the Confederate government, and Edward Baker, who was the close friend of Abraham Lincoln, who was a senator from Oregon at that time. And Benjamin spoke first, and he defended the right of the South to secede based on the concept of national sovereignty. And he quoted from a number of European sources, legal sources on this question of sovereignty. Now, the way that Baker answered him, and this is not the entirety of the debate at all, but the way that Baker answered him on this question of sovereignty is he said that sovereignty as it had been understood in Europe has no bearing upon the principle of sovereignty as it exists in the United States. And, he talked about this. And, he talked about the fact that, at the time of the Civil War, or if you had gone back 100 years earlier or 200 years earlier, you had what, would be considered sovereign nation states, France, England, and a lot of these smaller, principalities and dukedoms and stuff considered themselves sovereign. But what Baker pointed out is that these were all still oligarchical states based on an aristocracy, an elite, and that sovereignty among such oligarchical states really meant nothing less than an agreement between these various oligarchical rulers to respect the national boundaries and the rights of the neighboring oligarchical states. And Baker called this a feudal concept of sovereignty, a concept of sovereignty rooted in feudal institutions. And what he said, and what I just want to discuss briefly, is that the concept of sovereignty in the United States is entirely different because it lies in the people. And if you look at the founding documents of the American Republic, the Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Or if you look at the preamble of the Constitution, which mandates that the government of the Republic shall act to protect and defend the general welfare of all of the people and their posterity. What you have in the American Republic, as it was founded, and as Lincoln fought to recreate, is the idea of a republic in which sovereignty lies entirely in the people. It is not an agreement among the elites of various countries, but that the sovereignty of the United States rests in the sovereignty of the people, and that the elected representatives of the people are bound by the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution to act in service to the people and to their posterity for future generations. Now, if you think of what has transpired in the United States over the last 20 years, and you could certainly go back longer than 20 years. I mean, you could go back 30, 40 years or more. But if you just sort of take as a starting point the inauguration of George W. Bush in January of 2001, and if you take the 20-year period since then, what we have seen is that the government of the United States, the various institutions of the government of the United States, and the elites of the United States have acted in such a way which not only betrays the mandate of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, but they've acted in such a way and imposed policies which have step by step not only betrayed the people of the United States, but acted to destroy the people of the United States. Now, unless you're an elitist, there is really no way to argue with that. I mean, what we have witnessed is the almost complete destruction, not complete, but large-scale destruction of the productive economy of this nation, agriculture, certainly manufacturing, infrastructure. It has been torn down through policies of free trade, financial speculation. Laws have been passed to make this easier, like the infamous NAFTA Act, and many, many other laws have been passed which have taken down the productive economy of the United States. We have been engaged, beginning in 2001, in a series of endless wars, which really are colonial wars all over the world, which only Donald Trump tried to bring to a halt. We have, as has become, very notorious and very topical now on the internet, since 2001, since the initial passage of the Patriot Act, even worse laws have been passed, worse practices have been adopted, moving us in the direction of a surveillance state, a police state. And in my mind, one of the greatest crimes that has been committed, which receives far, far too little media coverage, even among some of the better people in the alternative media, one of the greatest crimes that has been committed is the drug pandemic, the drug epidemic. Forget COVID. The drug pandemic, the drug epidemic is literally destroying this nation. There was just a report released within the last week, which documented, I forget who released the report, but it documented that since the inauguration of George Bush, more than 500,000 Americans, more than 500,000 Americans have died of opioid overdoses, died from drug overdoses, just opioid. This doesn't even count other drugs. Now, that's the same amount of Americans who lost their lives in World War II. We have lost the equivalent of all of the deaths, American deaths in World War II, to opioids, to narcotics, over the last 20 years. And now we see Biden opening up the border, and Biden certainly doesn't intend to enforce the drug laws anyway. But opening up the border with Mexico, which is going to allow more of this murderous poison to enter the United States. So you look at this and you look at the destruction of our economy, the destruction of our educational system, the endless wars, 500,000 narcotics deaths in the last 2 decades. And you ask yourself, how can a government which is founded on the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution, how can the elected representatives of the people who swear an oath to that Constitution, on what basis in which they are supposedly operating on behalf of, in a bond of a pledge, a promise to defend the general welfare, on what basis could they do these things? And this really defines the fight today. And it is not, again, as I've said many times in this podcast, and as I think many people are beginning to realize, it is not a question of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, because this has been done to us by Republican presidents and Republican senators and congressmen, as well as Democratic presidents and Democratic senators and congressmen. That we are in a crisis in which we have been betrayed and in which the nation has been, to a significant degree, destroyed. And the only way back is if we insist on returning to the principles which founded this nation. You could look at the situation we're in and you could say, this is hopeless. This is too big. But the crisis we're in today, and the fight, the level of the fight that this is going to involve, this crisis is no worse than the crisis that Lincoln faced. In January of 1861, it was doubtful, or at least highly questionable, whether the United States, whether the American Republic was going to continue. The Republic created in 1876. We were in an existential moment. And Lincoln found a means to overcome that crisis. And that's the challenge to each of us today, but we have to understand what the nature of this fight is. The government should do nothing, ever. Now, of course, they're going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But in terms of their intention, they should do nothing ever, which is not on behalf of the general welfare of the people. And that's what we have to hold people to. On economic policy, on educational policy, on science policy, on drugs, that is the yardstick. That's the measuring rod we use. Now, the only other thing I want to say before we jump into this is and obviously there's many things we covered in these podcasts. I mean, in my mind, how Lincoln went about creating the Republican Party is very relevant to what we're doing today. We spent an entire podcast on that. Also, this question of a sovereign economic, banking, and credit system, the greenback policy, the national banking policy. This has great relevance today, given the what has happened to our financial institutions. and the role they've played in destroying our productive economy over the last 20 years. So we can get into a lot of that. But the one thing that I just want to bring up is that in one of the earlier podcasts, I forget which one, I talked a little bit about the wide awake movement. I want to say a few more things about that here, because I think it is, there's a lot that people could think about, a lot that we could learn from what was done. Now, for those who missed the podcast, the wide awake movement was created in the late winter, that is, I don't know, February, March of 1860. It was created in Hartford, Connecticut, the first chapter. And it was created at that time. One of the reasons it was created was to support the Republican candidate who was running for governor of Connecticut. But it quickly spread, first in New England, then New York, then very rapidly during the summer and the autumn of 1861, it spread all over the country. By the fall of 1861, the wide awake movement was fully mobilized, and this became its, really its reason for existence. It was fully mobilized to achieve the election of Abraham Lincoln as president. It essentially became, a leading component of the Lincoln election campaign. Now, there were hundreds of chapters of this by the fall of 1860, hundreds of chapters. No one knows how many people were involved in it. The minimum estimate that's given is 100,000. But there are other estimates which say it could have been as high as 300, 400, even perhaps 500,000 people. Most of the chapters were no more than 50 to 100, at most 200 people. And there were thousands and thousands of these chapters everywhere, from Maine to San Francisco. They had parades, they had rallies. Mostly they did a lot of parades, but they did rallies, and they had big banners and big signs. Their motto was free soil, or free speech, free soil, free men. But the reason why I want to mention them is not to go into depth into their history, but because the overwhelming majority of the people involved in the wide awake movement were young people. More than half of them were in their 20s. Some were younger, 18, 16. Some were a little older, 25, 30. The vast majority of them were under 30 years old. It was a youth movement. It was young people. They all over the country, and rallying to rescue the republic. The fact of the matter is that the party bosses, even many, although some, Lincoln liked it, and some grew to like it, like William Seward and some others. But some of the old Whig party bosses and even the Republican Party, bigwigs, they didn't like it. They didn't like it because they had no control over it. It wasn't organized top down. It was organized bottom up. It was organized. I mean, for instance, some of the chapters back east, in Hartford and some of these other places, Boston and New York, during the summer of 1860, they were getting thousands, maybe tens of thousands of letters written to them by people in Ohio, people in Indiana, people who were 18, 19, 20, 25 years old, including young women, saying, we want to organize a chapter in our town. We want to do this here. How do we do it? How did you do it? How do we go about doing it? And this was a movement that was organized by young people who recognized that they did not have a future unless they acted to rescue the country. Now, today, what you see is a lot of people, forget, Chuck Schumer and these snakes in the Democratic Party, right? Forget them. We know who they are. That crowd. But think of the problem Trump has in the Republican Party. You have 50,000 people turn out to see Trump. 75,000 people turn out to see Trump. Do you think a lot of these rhinos like that? They don't like it because it's something they can't control, right? They want to be able to try to control this thing, to keep it within limits, in the same way they tried to sabotage what Trump was trying to do for the 4 years he was in office. And what you see, you take the motto of the Wide Awake movement, free speech, free soil, free men. You took what Lincoln said at the 1856 Bloomington Convention in Illinois when he created the Republican Party. He said, we are going to re-recruit the American people to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And that's what the Wide Awake movement did with hundreds of thousands of young people, in the United States. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the Wide Awake movement, and this should be a lesson to all of us today, is they didn't say, forget the Democrats, they're hopeless. We're going to organize in Boston and Vermont and other places where people are already for Lincoln. They didn't call them red and blue states then, but if you use the equivalent of today, they'd say, we're going to organize in the red states. That's not what they did. They actually had a saying, which was, wherever the fight is hottest, that is our post of duty. And there the wide awakes are to be found. And they had a deliberate strategy that they were going to create chapters, recruit people to create new chapters and have marches and have campaign activity in areas that had voted Democratic in the previous elections. And I'll give you one example, which is that Vermont had always voted for the Whigs, always. And there was wide awake chapters in Vermont, but they didn't do very much. But next door to Vermont was New Hampshire, which in every presidential election between 1832 and 1856, every election, New Hampshire had voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. And during the summer and fall of 1860, the wide awakes were all over New Hampshire. Marches, rallies, right? They went where the fight was, and that's where they organized. And this idea today where people say, oh, well, the Democratic states are hopeless, we got to build up our base in the red states. That's idiotic. That's suicidal. Look, Trump would have lost the 2016 election if he adopted that strategy. Because what did Hillary Clinton and people say? They said, we're going to win because we got the blue wall in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan. It's the blue wall. And Trump went right in there. And that should be the way we think about it today. So the wide awake movement can tell us a lot in terms of the kind of, attitude, the kind of approach we should take to what we're doing. And, I think also that, in terms of young people, I actually have a little slogan. Some people told me it's a little hokey, but when we're organizing 20-year-olds today, we can say, don't be woke, be wide awake. And maybe that'll provoke some interesting discussions. So look, I'm going to stop there, Mike, because I want to really leave a lot of time for questions and discussion and see what our participants want to talk about.